2 million years ago, on a stretch of open grassland in what is now East Africa, the temperature at midday climbed past 40 degrees Celsius. The ground shimmered, the air itself seemed to bend, and somewhere in that heat a small band of early humans kept moving. Because stopping was not actually safer than walking. There was no shade for miles, there was no water in sight. And there would not be another drop to drink for hours, maybe longer. How does a soft-skinned, slow-running, thin-limbed primate survive that? Not survive it once as a fluke of luck, but survive it again and again for millions of summers across a landscape that had no mercy built into it at all? The answer is stranger and far more impressive than most people realize. Because surviving extreme heat was not something early humans simply endured. It was something that physically rebuilt their bodies from the inside out and eventually gave them one of the strangest superpowers in the entire animal kingdom. This is the story of that first, long, brutal, world-shaping summer and the millions of summers that followed it. To understand what early humans were actually up against, you first have to understand where they were living. The fossil and archaeological record places the earliest members of the human lineage overwhelmingly in the tropical and subtropical regions of Africa, areas that today include some of the hottest, driest, most seasonally punishing environments on the planet. This was not an accident of geography. It was the stage on which the entire human body plan was assembled. Paleoclimatologists reconstructing ancient African environments using evidence from ancient soil chemistry, fossilized pollen, and lake sediment cores have found that the climate across much of this region was not gently warm. It swung dramatically between wetter and drier phases over tens of thousands of years, driven by the same kind of long, slow orbital rhythms that would later lock the northern hemisphere into ice ages. During the driest phases, grasslands expanded, forests shrank, and standing water became scarce and unpredictable. Early hominins were not living in a static paradise. They were living through a climate that kept testing them, over and over, with punishing dry seasons layered on top of already extreme daytime heat. This is the part that surprises most people. The single greatest physical threat facing an early human walking across open savanna at midday was not a predator. It was the sun. The human body has a narrow tolerance for internal temperature. Core body temperature normally sits close to 37 degrees Celsius, and once it climbs past roughly 40 degrees, the proteins that keep your cells functioning correctly begin to break down. Above 41 or 42 degrees, heat stroke sets in. Organs begin to fail. Left uncorrected, this is fatal, often within hours. On an open plain with no shade, under direct tropical sun, a resting adult human can absorb enough radiant heat to push toward that danger zone in well under an hour, and physical exertion, like walking, running, or hunting, accelerates that timeline dramatically. So the question is not really why early humans needed to solve the heat problem. The question is how they solved it well enough to become one of the most heat-tolerant large mammals that has ever existed. The first part of the answer is not behavioral at all. It is written directly into human anatomy, and it likely began evolving millions of years before anything resembling a modern human ever existed. Compare a human to almost any other primate, and one difference stands out immediately. Humans are, relative to their body size, dramatically less hairy. Researchers studying the genetics and evolutionary history of skin and hair have proposed that this loss of dense body fur was directly tied to thermoregulation, the ability to shed excess heat efficiently. A furred mammal cooling itself in extreme heat is fighting its own insulation. A comparatively hairless one is not. But losing fur alone does not explain human heat tolerance. The real engineering marvel sits in the skin itself. Humans possess somewhere between 2 and 4 million sweat glands distributed across nearly the entire body, a staggering number compared to other primates, most of which rely far more heavily on panting or localized sweating. Human eccrine sweat glands can produce over a liter of sweat per hour under extreme heat and exertion, and as that sweat evaporates off the skin, it pulls heat away with remarkable efficiency, an extraordinary cooling system that researchers studying comparative primate physiology consider one of the more distinctive adaptations separating humans from their closest relatives. There is a genuinely fascinating hypothesis connected to this evolutionary story, one that researchers studying human running biomechanics have argued reshapes how we think about the earliest hunting strategies. Humans are, by large mammal standards, slow sprinters. A cheetah, a gazelle, even a healthy adult antelope can outrun a human easily over a short distance. But over long distances, in the heat of the day, something changes. Four-legged mammals that pant to cool themselves cannot pant efficiently while galloping, because the same muscles used for breathing are also used for the galloping stride. This means a running antelope in extreme heat faces a brutal trade-off: keep running and its body temperature will climb dangerously. Because it physically cannot pant hard enough while its body is locked into a full gallop. A human, cooling primarily through sweat rather than panting, does not face that same trade-off and can run continuously, breathing normally, for far longer than most four-legged prey animals can sustain a full sprint in the heat. Researchers studying this pattern, most notably in biomechanics research published in the early 2000s, have proposed that early humans may have exploited this exact physiological gap through persistence hunting, tracking an animal for hours across open, hot terrain, not to outrun it in a burst of speed, but to outlast it until the animal's own body temperature became its greatest enemy. It is important to be precise about what is confirmed here and what remains a compelling hypothesis. The physiological difference in heat tolerance between running humans and running quadrupeds is well documented and measurable. Direct fossil proof of persistence hunting as a widespread ancient strategy is much harder to establish, since running itself leaves no direct trace in the archaeological record. What supports the idea are ethnographic observations of some modern hunter-gatherer groups, including certain San communities in the Kalahari, who have been documented using persistence hunting techniques into the 20th century, chasing an animal like a kudu across open terrain in the heat of the day until it collapses from exhaustion and heat stress. This offers a compelling real-world parallel, but researchers are careful to describe ancient persistence hunting as a strong and biomechanically supported hypothesis rather than a directly proven universal practice among all early humans. Whether or not persistence hunting was common, one thing is certain. Early humans were moving and working during the hottest parts of the day far more than almost any other large mammal on the savanna, and that meant water was not a convenience. It was the single limiting factor on survival. An adult human in hot, dry conditions performing moderate physical activity can lose well over a liter of water per hour through sweat alone. Without replacement, dehydration sets in quickly. Blood volume drops, the heart works harder to circulate less blood while still carrying heat to the skin, cognitive function degrades, and physical performance collapses. In extreme cases, severe dehydration combined with heat exposure is fatal within a single day. For early humans, finding, tracking, and returning to reliable water sources was arguably the most important survival skill they possessed, more immediately dangerous in the short term than finding food. Archaeological and geological evidence shows that many of the earliest and most important hominin fossil sites, places like the shores of ancient Lake Turkana in Kenya, or the river systems running through Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, are located near what were once reliable water sources. This is not a coincidence of preservation. It reflects where early humans could actually survive long enough to leave evidence behind at all. Life away from dependable water in that climate was, for most of the year, simply not sustainable. But rivers and lakes were not always close, and dry seasons could stretch on for months. So early humans and the more recent hunter-gatherer groups whose practices offer researchers an indirect but valuable window into ancient survival strategies developed remarkably sophisticated methods for finding water in landscapes that appeared, to an untrained eye, completely dry. ethnographic studies of San communities in the Kalahari Desert. Conducted across the 20th century by anthropologists documenting traditional survival knowledge, describe an extraordinary depth of environmental awareness passed down across generations. Certain plants, including wild melons known as sama and various underground tubers, store significant water within their flesh, and traditional trackers learn to identify them from subtle surface signs. A leaf shape, a pattern of vine growth, even when barely visible above the sand. Digging a short distance down could reveal a tuber holding enough moisture to sustain a person for a day without ever finding open water. This kind of precise, landscape-specific knowledge almost certainly has roots stretching back far deeper than living memory. Archaeology has also produced direct, physical evidence of ancient water technology, rather than only indirect inference. At Diepkloof Rock Shelter in South Africa, archaeologists recovered fragments of ostrich eggshell that had been deliberately hollowed, engraved with careful geometric patterns, and used as portable water containers. These artifacts have been dated to roughly 60,000 years ago, making them among the oldest known examples of humans deliberately manufacturing containers to carry water away from its source. This is not speculation. It is a direct physical artifact showing that tens of thousands of years ago, humans had already solved a critical logistical problem: how to detach yourself from a water source, at least temporarily, and carry survival with you. Solving the water problem also meant solving the shade problem, because the two threats, heat and dehydration, compound each other constantly. A body exposed to direct, unshaded sun heats up faster and sweats more to compensate, burning through water reserves at an accelerated rate. Shade was not comfort. It was a direct multiplier on how long your water would last. Researchers studying modern hunter-gatherer groups in hot climates have documented a consistent, near-universal pattern. A sharp reduction in strenuous outdoor activity during the hottest hours of the day, roughly late morning through mid-afternoon, followed by increased activity around dawn and dusk. This midday retreat cannot be directly observed in the deep archaeological past, but the physiological pressure driving it, the sharp rise in heat stroke risk during peak solar hours, would have applied just as forcefully to early humans as it does today. It is a reasonable, widely supported inference rather than a directly observed ancient behavior. Natural rock shelters and cave overhangs, common across many of the regions where early human fossils and tools have been recovered, would have offered an obvious and immediate solution during these hottest hours. And archaeological excavations at numerous African cave sites show long, repeated patterns of human occupation stretching across enormous spans of time, consistent with these locations serving as reliable seasonal or daily refuges. Stone walls and rock overhangs absorb and buffer heat far more slowly than open ground exposed to direct sun, keeping interior temperatures measurably cooler and creating pockets of survivable shade in landscapes that otherwise offered almost none. Where natural shelter was not available, early humans appear to have built their own, though the evidence grows more fragile the further back in time you go. Post holes and arranged stone circles found at certain African sites, more commonly associated with later prehistoric periods, suggest that simple shade structures, branches, hides, or woven plant material arranged to block direct sun were well within early human capability long before any of it survived clearly enough to be dated with confidence. This part of the story leans more heavily on reasonable inference than on direct physical proof. Skin itself became another battlefield in the fight against solar exposure, and this is where the story connects to something almost every human alive today still carries, quite literally, on their body. As early humans lost dense body hair, the bare skin beneath was suddenly exposed to intense ultraviolet radiation for the first time in the lineage's evolutionary history. Researchers studying the genetics of skin pigmentation, including comparative work on the genes controlling melanin production, have found strong evidence that darker skin evolved specifically as a protective response to this new vulnerability. Melanin absorbs and scatters ultraviolet radiation before it can damage the DNA in skin cells, reducing the risk of sunburn and over long timescales. UV-related damage that could impair survival and reproduction. One of the most visible traits in human biology, skin color, appears to be directly tied to the ancient pressure of surviving relentless equatorial sun. There is also intriguing, more provisional evidence that early humans may have used external materials for physical sun protection layered on top of their own biology. Ochre, a natural iron-rich pigment ranging from yellow to deep red, appears at numerous early human archaeological sites, sometimes ground down and processed rather than used in its raw state. While ochre use is most commonly discussed in connection with symbolic or artistic behavior, some researchers have tested its physical properties directly on skin and found that it can measurably block a portion of incoming ultraviolet radiation, functioning not unlike a primitive sunscreen. This remains genuinely debated. It is not confirmed as the primary or original reason ochre was used, and symbolic, practical, and protective purposes are not mutually exclusive, but the UV-blocking effect itself has been measured directly in controlled studies. Food presented its own set of challenges once summer heat and dry season scarcity combined. As standing water and lush vegetation retreated during the driest months, many of the plant foods early humans relied on became harder to find, forcing greater dependence on foods that could survive drought conditions, deep-growing tubers and roots, tough seed pods, and the animals that themselves had adapted to survive on minimal water. Hunting in extreme heat carried its own risks, since a hunter exerting significant physical effort under direct sun faced exactly the same dehydration and overheating dangers as any other strenuous activity, which is part of why so many hunting and gathering strategies documented among modern desert-dwelling groups cluster activity around the cooler hours of morning and evening rather than the punishing heat of midday. The changing seasons also drove movement, and movement across an unpredictable, drought-prone landscape required an intimate, accumulated knowledge of the land built up over many generations. Reconstructions of ancient rainfall patterns indicate that some regions of Africa experienced extended humid intervals at various points in prehistory. Periods when what is now harsh deserts supported lakes, rivers, and green corridors capable of supporting long-distance movement. Researchers studying one of the most striking of these intervals, often called a Green Sahara period, have found ancient lakebeds, fossilized fish remains, and rock art depicting swimming figures deep within what is today an extremely arid landscape. These humid intervals opened and closed over thousands of years, driven by the same long orbital cycles that reshaped climate elsewhere on the planet, and some researchers propose that these shifting green corridors periodically allowed human populations to expand into new territory during wetter phases. This remains an active area of paleoclimate research. And while the humid intervals themselves are well documented, the precise role they played in specific human migrations is still being studied. None of this survival knowledge, the location of hidden water tubers, the timing of seasonal migrations, the subtle signs of an approaching dry spell, existed in any written form. It had to be observed, remembered, and deliberately passed down, generation after generation, through direct demonstration, oral instruction, and simple trial and error, with the cost of forgetting measured in human lives rather than inconvenience. Anthropologists studying the depth and specificity of environmental knowledge held by modern hunter-gatherer communities living in extreme climates have repeatedly been struck by how detailed, layered, and precisely calibrated to local conditions this knowledge is, evidence, though indirect, of just how much accumulated experience must have gone into surviving these landscapes successfully across countless generations before any of it could be written down at all. Surviving summer heat was never a solitary achievement either. Water sources, particularly during the driest stretches of the year, were often scarce enough that access to them required cooperation and direct social relationships between neighboring groups. Anthropological research on resource sharing among modern groups living in arid environments has documented customary systems governing access to key water points, often involving reciprocal obligations built up over long periods of trust between different families or bands. These specific social systems cannot be directly observed in the deep past. But the underlying pressure that would have produced something similar, a scarce, unevenly distributed life-or-death resource, would have applied just as strongly to early human groups navigating a drought-prone landscape millions of years ago. By the time fully modern humans were expanding across Africa and eventually into the rest of the world, they were carrying with them a physiology and a body of accumulated behavioral knowledge shaped directly by an almost unimaginable number of brutal, punishing summers. The dense network of sweat glands, the comparatively hairless skin, the pigmentation calibrated to local sun exposure, the instinct to move during cool hours and rest during hot ones, the knowledge of where water hid beneath dry, cracked ground. None of this was incidental. Each piece was hammered into the human body and the human behavioral repertoire by an environment that offered no forgiveness for getting it wrong. And this inheritance did not disappear once humans began moving into cooler climates far from the equatorial regions where these adaptations first evolved. The same sweat-based cooling system, the same physiological heat tolerance, remained embedded in human biology, quietly waiting, ready to be called on again whenever a descendant tens of thousands of years and thousands of kilometers removed from the African savanna found themselves working hard under a punishing summer sun. Every time you sweat through a hot afternoon today, every time your body cools itself through evaporation rather than panting, you are relying on a system that was not designed for comfort. It was built, gradually and mercilessly, across millions of years by ancestors who had absolutely no other choice. They walked across landscapes with no shade in sight. They tracked water hidden beneath the sand. They learned, through nothing but bitter necessity, exactly how far a human body could be pushed by heat before it broke. And they built, cell by cell and generation by generation, a body capable of pushing that limit further than almost any other large mammal alive. The first summer was not a single event. It was millions of them, stacked one on top of another, each one a small, brutal exam that either got passed down through survival or erased entirely through failure. And every person alive today is descended, without exception, from ancestors who kept passing that exam summer after summer for millions of years until survival stopped being a matter of luck and became something written permanently into the human body itself.